Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It's good to be with you this week for a very special crossover podcast episode. That's right. If you listen to our show regularly, you may have noticed that we did not publish an episode last week, and that's because we were busy recording an episode for our partner podcast or some friends, colleagues over at the Schematic podcast, which is the official podcast of a website called the Cinematropolis, which is a website dedicated to bringing a thoughtful, analysis-driven conversation about the imaginative stories and diverse, independent voices working in the arts and film. So they cover a wide range, mostly film, classics, trending indie films, films that time has forgotten, viewers have forgotten, and big budget feature films from modern day, including the new film Civil War that just came out recently. So Caleb Masters, who's one of the founders and hosts of the Schematic, together with his colleague LaRon Chapman, invited me and Oklahoma City Council member James Cooper on their show to discuss this film, Civil War. If you're interested in reading their written review of the film, you can go to thecinematropolis.com, and it's on the homepage right there. It was published, I think, just today. This is Wednesday, April 17th, that you are listening, or that I'm recording this. And it's a film about what the title says, right? It's a film about America embroiled in a modern-day civil war. There's not a lot of context about how we got there, but I think we can all assume that it was this, I'm gesturing wildly, like these uncertain times, these hyper-partisan times that we live in. So the first part of the episode will be our conversation about those themes, about that issue, some of which, how it intersects with this film and with other films. And then in the latter half of the episode, they will get into, I leave, and then Caleb, James, and LaRon get into a conversation, more of a review of the film. And I think there's maybe two sections, one that's spoiler-free and then one that is definitely about spoilers. So if you're someone who doesn't like spoilers and you want to listen to this episode, you're fine. Listen to it. I'll be on for the first chunk of it, and then it'll get into a section where they will let you know, we're moving into the new section with spoilers, and you can disconnect then, or you can listen to it. Who cares, right? Time is a flat circle. Spoilers happen all the time. I think it's safe to say that I assume America survives. That's usually how these films work out. I don't know. I haven't actually seen it yet. I've been busy. But this is a great way. I'm going to go listen to this episode myself now, including the spoilers, because I want to hear how the film ends. We will be back in just a few days with a regular episode that's talking about the legislative process. We are quickly approaching one of the final deadlines. We're only about a month out from the end of session. The budget bills are dropping. Negotiations are, theoretically happening. There's been some big votes this week that have failed. There have been some new opportunities for engagement, for advocacy from people like you. We're going to talk about that all later this week. So enjoy this bonus episode, crossover with the Schematic podcast, and then catch our next episode later this week. That's your regular update. Okay. With that, on with the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Schematic, the official podcast of the Cinematropolis.com, your home to thoughtful conversations on film. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and today we are watching the final chapter of American democracy unfold on the big screen, because today we're reviewing Alex Garland's Civil War. So today's going to flow a little differently than the normal episode. We are going to kick things off with, instead of a short little icebreaker section, we're actually going to have an in-depth pre-review discussion talking about what a story like Civil War means for our broader culture. Why is it being released right now? What does that mean? How should audiences talk about this or think about it? And from there, we'll jump into our spoiler-free review, where we'll provide a verdict on the film. And then, as always, we'll conclude the show by going into a spoiler discussion. Now, we have a really exciting panel today. In my opinion, probably some of the most qualified people to talk about a movie like Civil War in the Oklahoma City Metro. LaRon Chapman, my co-host and award-winning Oklahoma filmmaker. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you for having me. And I also feel like I'm coming at this movie with a different perception of it than I did going into it. And I think that's a good thing.
Ooh, now I'm curious. But in all seriousness, LaRon Chapman, highly qualified to review films. Have you read his Real Insights with LaRon column that he has on the cinematropolis.com? Check it out. I am also excited to welcome back. He is an Oklahoma City council person, OCU English and Modern Languages artist in residence, film professor, also member of the Oklahoma Film Critics Circle, James Cooper. James, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I just thought, an intersection between, I don't want to say politics, but, there's probably going to be political adjacent things in film and film history. Thought it might be a good time to bring you back on. And last but certainly not least, I'm very excited to welcome for the first time the founder and CEO of Let's Fix This, Andy Moore. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Caleb. Great to be here.
Well, listeners, before we get into today's review, I just wanted to note that if you're enjoying the show, you're finding, quality information from the show, is the show enriching your life? Please support us by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review on your preferred podcast app. Now, with that said, let's jump right into our pre-review discussion. Alex Garland's Civil War. Because this movie is a film by Alex Garland, who is a filmmaker I really, really like. However, his films are often challenging in a variety of different ways. And because Civil War is about a very charged subject matter, we brought on, as I said, two of the most qualified people in the Oklahoma City area to talk with us about the release of Civil War and what it means for the broader culture, especially as we are heading into an election season this fall. With that said, unfortunately, due to some extremely tight scheduling constraints, Andy has not been able to see the movie. However, given his passion and enthusiasm for the film, and also his position as the CEO of Let's Fix This, he's agreed to talk with us about the film alongside James Cooper. So we're going to jump into the film, talk a little bit about what does this mean, and when we say what does this mean, why release a film like Civil War in an election year? How should audiences think about what this movie means today? What should the conversations about this film be like? All things I want to really examine in the review discussion, but let's first kind of set the groundwork by turning it to Andy. Now, Andy, maybe you could just start by telling a lot of our listeners who might not be familiar with Let's Fix This. What is your organization about, and what interests you about the premise of Civil War?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again for having me on. Let's Fix This is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that, really we just care about democracy. We started in 2016 in response to some really egregious issues with the state budget that were happening at the time. And through that, connected with thousands of Oklahomans who I discovered had an equally deep passion for our state, but weren't always sure where to get plugged in, and often feel like their vote doesn't matter, their voice doesn't matter. And I think together, this has been like a collective experiment of learning how to be effective advocates, learning that voting really does matter, and then helping people get registered to vote, be educated to vote, and participate in the civic process. It's been 8 years. It's been a trip that I did not expect in the beginning. I didn't set out to start a nonprofit, but it's been immensely rewarding. And films like this, I think, when Let's Fix This started in 2016 about the state budget, we did not envision the possibility that America would be facing this hyperpartisan breakdown of society and democracy before our very eyes. And to be clear, we started in early 2016, in like March, before we even knew what the presidential election would shape up to be like, before we even knew who the nominees would be. There are a lot of organizations that started in late 2016 after the election where Donald Trump won. And I think that gives me a little bit of a different perspective, that I got involved just as that was unfolding. I think as a lot of us saw America kind of coming to terms with what that campaign would look like, or what that election looked like. Obviously now, having been through Trump's first term, the very contentious 2020 election, and on the precipice of the 2024 election, where we've seen I mean, we've seen America divided in ways that we haven't seen for a couple of hundred years.
And that's one of the things I just wanted to really dive into here when we're thinking about why release this film right now. I mean, the movie is about a civil war. I will say it's very vague in what that entails. As a millennial, this is probably the most politically divided the country has been in my lifetime, where it's hard to even have real meaningful conversations with people who have a different perspective or worldview than you. With a film like this, do you see this as more as a conversation starter? Do you see this as a remedy? What do you hope to see from a movie like Civil War being released?
Yeah. I mean, I hope it's a conversation starter. Where we're at as a country is the product of some trends that have been happening at least since the 1960s. James has done a great history review of this and some other events I've been at. I'm sure he'll bring some of this up during our conversation. But when you look at some of the the self-sorting of society along different types of identity, especially political ideation or political party affiliation, the trends that started in the 60s around civil rights that have crystallized over the last 60 years lead us very naturally to where we're at right now. And unfortunately for us, that means that we are living through this flashpoint in American society. There had been points, right, in the 60s included, like in 1968 was incredibly divisive, right? They literally shot the president. Like things were happening in the 60s that haven't yet happened in present day. But I think we have all started to realize, especially from January 6th onward, that there is the real potential for both like hot war and kind of like internal Cold War in America, where factions of people not only don't communicate with one another, but have an active unrest and I would say discord, but it's like more than that. There's like an actual like disdain for our fellow Americans in ways that we certainly have, none of us have seen in our lifetime. And so I think it has been coming out, and there have been efforts for the last 6 or 7 years to like address this partisan divide. There's been lots of bridge building efforts across the country that have been doing great work, but not everyone tunes into those. And so by leveraging Hollywood's, I'll say bully pulpit, but like their mass market reach, they are forcing us as Americans to wrestle with ideas that a lot of us probably have like talked about only in small conversations, like with your friends, people you feel safe with, but to sit in an open theater and watch something that used to seem impossible, but now seems plausible is a very different conversation.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And James, I want to turn to you. Again, you have a uniquely qualified to talk as a person who is serving on the city council here in Oklahoma City. You also are extremely well versed in film studies and also just American history. Someone's making a movie about a Civil War set basically tomorrow.
Yes.
When you're looking at a film like Civil War, what is it exactly you're looking for?
I have deep concerns about anyone making a film called Civil War in America, like period. Like that's going to be a problem for me. Remember, my background is studying the representation of media violence, largely because, I was born in 82 and got to senior year of high school. And that April was when Columbine happened. And as you all recall, whether it was Hillary Clinton on the left in terms of the Democratic Party or John McCain on the right, the supposed maverick of that party, everyone had the answer for why Columbine happened. It was The Matrix. It was Marilyn Manson. It was gangster rap. It was, literally the aesthetic of The Matrix, right? Violent video games like Doom. And I was like, they're describing everything in my bedroom, I went to school as an undergrad in film studies to test their thesis. And then that led me to research the root causes of real life crime and violence, right? So it's intersections between, sociology, psychology, criminology, philosophy, film study. It was just all of it. And what I came away from that research split in some ways. On the one hand, what I came to learn is that they were wrong, right? These critics, these cultural critics, that what actually is happening is that these works of art are reflecting what's already in the society. That's what culture does. It's a mirror, right? Sometimes intentionally by the artist, sometimes unintentionally. Sometimes people just make stuff and they're pulling from cultural signifiers, but they don't know what it means. They just do it. So on the one hand, things reflect. On the other hand, right? And this is where things get dangerous. And it's hard for people to wrap their heads around in a lot of ways. The danger is, so film, as you all know, as a technology comes into existence in 1895. Thanks for tuning in for this history lesson. But 1895, but you don't get storytelling to 1903. And then 10 years later, you get truly one of the most dangerous films of all time, The Birth of a Nation. And that film is an adaptation, as we all recall, from The Klansman story. And in it, it rewrites the Civil War as a, quote, lost cause, as where the South is forced into the war by this northern aggressive government that is interrupting the genteel nature of the South and is forcing Black people to vote in the South, forcing Black people to run for political office. The Birth of a Nation makes it seem like these people, when they're finally in office, they have their feet up on the desk, they're eating fried chicken, they're like toddlers unleashed on the South and passing laws to have sex with white women. So the fear is white women are going to be raped by these Black men. Everyone, all the white people have to salute Black people on the streets. I mean, just these childish punishments for the way things were. And by the end of the movie makes the case that they had to create the Klan, had to save the South from this villainous North and these childish Black people. And Jesus literally appears at the end as they are stripping away the right to vote for these Black people. These are the dangerous images. Okay. And I think we have to be very, very careful anytime we have representations of violence in film. And I think we have to be very careful anytime we are trying to tell, quote unquote, the story of America, because our people can be kind of susceptible to myths. The final thing I have to say there, when I say we're susceptible to myths, the Klan membership had been on the decline after it began in the late 1860s and 70s. It was on the decline until Birth of a Nation came out. And when it comes out and Americans go to watch that movie, they look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, I guess the Klan is the hero. I should join the Klan. And that has real world consequences right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Klan is the one who burned this Black Wall Street neighborhood, Greenwood, to the ground. So I'm always worried when I see titles like Civil War in a film.
Alex Garland is British. I mean, we can all talk about this. This is just for the table, but what do you make of the idea that a British person is the one who came in to tell the story of America? I heard an interview with him. I can tell you what he said, but I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts.
I'm not wild about it.
I think there's pros and cons to that. There's you're not so entrenched in it to the extent that you have, like, as we have been indoctrinated from the first schooling that we get, that he might be able to look at it from a bird's eye view, but he's also, because he's not entrenched in it, he doesn't have certain insights that he's going to bring to it. So I feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword there, where he's kind of damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. But
and I want to clarify that I think I saw the same interview that you're probably going to reference, and that's part of, I probably don't care. Like, maybe you can do a good job. You don't, a heart surgeon doesn't have to have had heart surgery to be good at their job.
Sure.
But some of his responses, some of the media I've seen was like, I think this is a different than what I hoped, at least.
Yeah. So it was funny. I didn't watch them until today. I actually tried to go into the movie pretty with a clean palate, other than just some of the reactions I read online. he was saying in his South by Southwest interview that he's like, well, I'm really just trying to talk about the idea of civil war. It could be in any country, but I chose America because people look to America as an example. And I don't know. I'm still trying to process how I fully feel about that, because in some ways you're sort of extrapolating and trying to examine the idea of a civil war inherently. And there's some intellectual arguments or ideas that could be explored there. On the other hand, for him to do that at this time in the history of America as a non-American, it doesn't sit quite right, where you're like, wait, there's actually a lot of very specific things that are driving the separation, and he sort of doesn't talk about those. And not that he needs to make this a strong political statement, but on the other hand, it just seems kind of he's washing his hands of having to embrace the Americanism of the story.
James has his mouth agape, so
Yes.
I'm very curious what he's about to say.
Well, there's kind of two things. One, kind of going back to the representations of violence. What the research has also demonstrated to me is that the real type of violence we should be worried about on screen is not necessarily Jason with his machete killing somebody, but it's more actually kind of PGG and PG-13 violence, where the henchman gets killed but dies off screen.
Or the Christopher Nolan violence.
It's consequence-free violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Violence is conflict resolution, but we don't get to see the pain and suffering of the individual going through it.
Mm-hmm.
They die noble deaths, sometimes as the heroes, right? Or the henchman just dies off screen. When we let those films happen, and simultaneously in K through 12 schools, ask yourselves, do you remember taking classes on conflict resolutions and how to manage your emotions? And so when one doesn't have that in the society from the public level, like the public education institution, but meanwhile your media institution, Hollywood, right, is constantly, especially during the summer blockbuster season, pumping out movies that most parents have let their guard down when they see G, PG, PG-13, and they go, sure, let's go watch this movie where, again, we will resolve the conflict through violence. And very often these movies, particularly in the West, going all the way back to, the Odyssey as a story, you have this character who sacrifices themselves, right, for the good of the society or the family or their loved one. They die a valiant death at the end. What message does that send? And I want you to ask yourself, look at most of our school shooters in recent years, not just Uvalde, but when you look at the grocery stores or the concerts, what happens at the end of those stories, right? The person ends up taking their life, or, and there's a lot of research around this, Politico, if you were to Google them and mass shootings, you'd see some of this research, for instance. But often the shooter is wanting the police to shoot them. It is a murder-suicide. They have figured out in their mind, I know who to blame, right? It's migrants, it's these students, it's whomever, and they want the police there to kill them. And part of that is there's a pain they're going through in terms of like suicidal ideations. But the other part of that a lot of media scholarship talks about that's looking at violence is it's not just that individual. It is that the stories we pump out, think of the ending of Breaking Bad, think of the ending of Marvel's Avengers Endgame. It is constantly this hero who dies, frequently with their arms outstretched like the Christ figure. And we've been doing this again since the Odyssey. Now it's filmic images that are repeatable and remakeable over and over again. So I really worry about that. And that is hard for people to wrap their heads around because they're more afraid of Freddy Krueger images messing up their children. So I really worry about that. The second thing too is, yeah, sure. Someone from not America can make a movie about America. All they have to do is research. And so you asked what expectation I had going into this film. I hadn't really seen a trailer, but I had one major question. How many Black people were going to be in this movie? How many Black people? That was what I wanted to know. How many Black people and how prominently will they feature as protagonists? And if the answer is several, then that tells me someone has done their Civil War homework in this country.
Mm.
If the answer is this movie, so
Can I? I mean, I don't want to get off
No.
the
Yeah,
agenda here, but since James opened with this now, and I haven't seen the movie, I'm immensely curious. My hunch, based on the little that I have seen about the movie or knew about it in advance, I've kind of come into this expecting that it is a Hollywoodization of Civil War. Somewhat is just the name of it. And my concern for our democracy here in real life is that there's a movie could be done about this issue in a much more tangible way that tells a very different story than just like a Hollywood blockbuster Civil War. And that's my guess. Am I correct in that?
correct.
James says yes.
I wouldn't go blockbuster, but there's definitely a Hollywoodization of it. It's a different type of blockbuster. It's not like a Marvel type thing, but it does have a lot of, especially the last act. It's a thrill ride.
Okay.
It's a scary thrill ride.
And really, I mean, I've just seeing screenshots with like multiple fighter jets, and I was like, that's not what's going to happen first in the Civil War in today's world. But I'm not a military strategist either. But and we have history where America has bombed its own people in Tulsa. And I hope that doesn't happen. But I just felt like, this is going to be an overly dramatized Civil War from what is more likely to actually happen in.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Yeah.
It is an artsy fartsy blockbuster.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's what's happening.
It's an Alex Garland, because that's what he does,
Right.
because he makes really powerful, beautiful, evocative, provocative images but also he has the most money he's ever had to make a movie here. And Well, Laron, you've been really quiet. So we're going to move on to the next
I have
question.
been processing.
There's lots of process here. And
Sure.
I mean, I have more things I want to say on the note of this movie existing.
Yeah.
But just to kind of shift gears here a little bit, in terms of cultural impact, what do we see as the pros and cons of putting a story like Civil War on the big screen at this specific moment in history?
Well, some of what I took away from it in that sense is that it's probably going to amplify the cons, with being that it's going to amplify societal anxieties. And I do think that it, and/or kind of entrench the political divisions even further. That's the bad part of this. That's potential. And I'm not saying it's going to do that.
It's a risk, though.
But it's a risk that could possibly happen. And then I do think the pro here is that it might ask us, because I do think the film, and like I said, we're going to talk about it in greater detail when we get more into the plot points, but I do think that this film, as a feature and a bug, doesn't take a stance. And I think that going into it, and that's what I meant by my perception of it going into it, was like, oh God, do we need that right now? Like it's an election year. This is just chum for the Republican Party to just go, here comes some liberal propaganda. You know what I mean? To just kind of just stoke the divisions even further. And I feared that's what this movie was going to be. And what I was surprised by was almost how apolitical this movie kind of feels in that regard, by not really engaging with what the conflicts were between California and Texas.
So California and Texas are on a team versus.
Yes, we don't know why.
Yeah,
we don't. I mean, we have.
Well, we know that Nick Offerman, he's running his third term. He's dissolved the FBI.
There's like little breadcrumbs, but I mean, like in terms of like how that's played out for a year, during his entire, like the nuances of that, we don't know. We don't really hear conversations between those two separating parties. We just see like brutal violence between both sides, and it's kind of indistinguishable, who's who as you're going through this odyssey with the war photographers. So, and I think the pro to that for me is that by not placing it in any by any blame or on one side or the other, or making it, you are able kind of to use this as a blank canvas for insert your issue here, and how this could be potentially a cautionary tale about how, when this becomes so untenable, that this could be the result of that kind of that gestation of violence and cruelty towards the common man. But on the other side of that, it left me a little bit detached because I didn't have anything specific to grasp onto, and I have issues that do concern me right now. Like, and that being said, that is actually what I was calling for not to happen with this movie ahead of it, because I thought it would be so on the nose and finger wavery. But then I left actually feeling like I wish I had, even in a hypothetical sense, something tangible to hold on to so that I could invest in that odyssey. And so I felt it feels more like a genre exercise than it does a political discourse film.
Yeah.
And that's interesting with a movie called Civil War.
It's very interesting. That's sort of I can't decide if I love it or hate it, because on one hand,
it's like what I asked for, but then I'm like, maybe I didn't need that. Maybe I did.
But
need
why
something
make?
specific.
But then why make the movie? Almost.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like because it's not really making a strong statement either way. But we'll get into that more in the specific review. But I do hear you that it's like the risks are it just stokes the fires versus potential pros are we're talking more about how this could be a terrible thing.
And what I mean by not taking a stance is that I'm sure he has a stance and he's asking everyone to bring their own thing to it. But the issue is that we don't have a conclusive point at the end of it to say, well, what did we learn? Who was to blame? You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? It just feels like it kind of doesn't give anybody, you know what I mean? Like I don't say the lecture, but you know what I mean? Like, see, there's no one to blame here, but people, if they're bringing their own stuff to it, are just going to blame the same thing they're blaming right now. You know what I mean? Which is, behind closed doors, we're arguing with other people, behind message boards and all of the kind of things. So I feel like we did need some aspect of a cause to fight for. And I don't know that the film provides that.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, Andy, just turning it to you, I mean, having not seen the film, when you think about the pros and cons of putting this movie out right now, what do you see when you think Civil War?
Like the term Civil War, and
which is the idea of putting this movie out. Like, what do you think are the upsides and downsides? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in shorthand, like upside is maybe some folks will be like, oh, I hadn't really thought about the fact that what war would look like here on our home turf, which is something we haven't seen since the Civil War, right? Like we haven't had like a battle here in the continental US. And maybe people need a Hollywood version to be like, oh gosh, that would be terrible. I don't think that's going to be the overwhelming takeaway for people. On the other side, like a dominating potential negative outcome is people seeing this and saying like, that's what we need to do. And like seeing it as like a inspiration, which I think speaks a little bit to what James was saying earlier. And we certainly don't want that either.
Right.
And that's where the taking the stance part is important, where I realize like having no stance, yes, allows you to put what you want onto it. But if you have bad intentions now,
right.
You know what I mean? Then this doesn't really provide we're
going to talk more about it when we get into the film. I do think this movie makes some very bold choices at the very end of the film.
Sure.
And, media literacy, I think, is a really big part of this too that we haven't touched on yet. And we'll talk about why that's important. But the movie is definitely putting some very provocative things out there. And my concern is that, at this table, we might be like, oh, I see what he's doing here.
Yeah.
But I also know that I grew up as a millennial with a generation of people who watched Fight Club and thought it was cool. So, they missed the point of the movie.
Yeah.
So like from where I'm standing, there's a huge risk in this movie coming out. It's very apolitical. But it's what you were saying, Andy. People could see it and say, man, you know what? This would fix things. Because while it doesn't take a strong stance, your main characters as the photojournalist are following a specific side throughout the film.
Mm-hmm. And we don't want to legitimize political violence.
Right. Correct.
Yeah. And I mean, to the point earlier, it is like, I know that, the director chose to put California and Texas together for many reasons, but one for the simple reason so that people couldn't be like,
to neutralize it
right
immediately.
He put a red state and a blue state together. There's probably, I can get into like voter registration and turnout data that makes sense for those two to be together. But I think just trying to tamp down on some of that so that viewers can come to it and say, oh, I'm not sure who the good guys are or who the bad guys are in this battle, because there's not that context provided, like, is the tiniest way to dial down on that knob. But I think when people come to the movie with whatever they're carrying, if they already view political violence as somewhat legitimate, then they might walk away being like, oh, I just need to get, I need to find a tank or a bigger gun or whatever, and like start strategizing around what they've seen. That's not remotely what America needs.
And I don't think that's the intention. I will say, I don't think that's the intention
same.
of the filmmaker, but I just, I don't trust, it's going to sound awful.
I don't
I don't
the people
necessarily
watching.
trust all of the audiences. I'll just put it that way.
No,
Right.
yeah, but we've had conversations with many people about divided political discourse, and it does seem like you said, if they're bringing what they have to this movie doesn't give you it shirks the accountability from said parties. You know what I mean? So you're like, who is the one that is accountable for what we're seeing here? You can say Nick Offerman, but it's still not quite, enough in terms of.
Well, we don't even know what Nick Offerman really stands for. Other than that, he's a
exactly.
dictator.
Exactly.
That's all we
got. That's all we can imprint. It's still, he's a blank canvas. Again, like insert, you can put Trump there. Someone else might be putting Biden there.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like in their head. So this whole pick your own adventure kind of approach to it. Yeah. I mean, like it kind of virtue signals in a way. It makes you feel like, okay, like you can make it work to your advantage, but it's not really solving the problem. It's just kind of circular.
Is it like a passive both sidesism?
Yeah.
Everyone nods at the same time.
It's just so vague. Like, it's just very vague. Like what we know is that he's in his third term, and that he has begun to dissolve other institutions that only give him more, so we can consolidate power.
Right.
That's really all we get. And no one's really talking about politics in the movie. They're just talking about how awful the Civil War is and how he's a monster, essentially.
But we don't even learn that he dissolves the FBI until
like way later.
Way late.
Okay.
Way late. I saw a PBS NewsHour segment earlier in the week where Judy Woodruff had gone to, and this will segue into my opinion in some ways about this film, not in some ways, in absolute terms. Judy Woodruff had gone to Oregon. Did y'all see this earlier this week? And it was part of her travels around the country to try and get to the roots of our political divides. She'd done the starting one was here in Oklahoma City a few months ago, you might recall, and the bombing playing a central role there. But she goes to Portland, and it's about the urban-rural divide. And what I did not know about Oregon until this news segment is that the residents in the eastern part of that state have been county by county by county. Andy shaking his head, so yes, he already knew. I did not know this. Have been county by county doing petitions, gaining signatures to secede from Oregon.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes. So to watch that news segment knowing I was going into this film, right, kind of shaped my entire view of the movie. And so they're trying to secede from Oregon. They want to join with, this is not just a simple idea. They want to join with Idaho. And because they believe that they have way more in common geographically with Idaho, but that same politically, their views align more with the Idaho state legislature and the way voters tend to vote there. And they're being very successful right now. Again, the likelihood of them succeeding and seceding are not strong, but this is a movement that is, another county just passed it the other day. And so one of the main reasons that they cite for why they wanted to do this wasn't just the geography, but they said that there were several decades back, I think it was the spotted owl, where I think it was maybe the EPA or some sort of environmental regulatory body said this creature is endangered. And so thusly the trees that it calls home we are going to protect. Well, that affected the lumber industry, right? Think Twin Peaks for all your listeners who love that sort of stuff in Washington and whatever. But it stopped jobs. And to my incredible shock, is I didn't know any of that backstory or this present story. And so immediately as I'm like listening to this in my little policy mind, I was like, well, that could have been resolved by getting these people retrained into new jobs. They did not. Not a spoiler. And so now a significant number of rural folk who live in Oregon blame Democrats as a party for that decision. And they've watched Portland and Eugene recover more quickly in the East. And they're like, well, what about us and our way of life and our incomes and abortion rights and gay people and immigration and crime? Like, so all of these things are all wrapped up together for them. And so to go watch a movie the same week that ignores any one of the issues I just named,
Right.
not just any one of them, all of them, is silly. I'm not someone who believes you can't make a movie about the Civil War. In fact, as I was listening to Andy earlier, I was like, well, heck, why not make a literal movie about the Civil War? When's the last time you saw a movie about the Civil War? You know what I mean? Is it Gettysburg? I don't know.
Probably,
Glory?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when was that? You can't do that. You can't figure out how to tell that story. Get out of here. Right. And so, no, that doesn't exist. But this movie just completely ignores that reality. It ignores the fact that you have people going back. By the way, all of this would be forgivable. I tried to shut off my intellectual tendencies. I really did. But the movie just kept like poking at me because it was like the main characters before they're like heading to Washington, D.C., the photographers are, but they're like, but first we're going to go to Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm like, whoa,
Yep.
what? And then they even they're like, oh yes, there was the great Antifa massacre. And like, whoa, what? And it just scoots right past all of it. Gives no context. What are we talking about? And so I don't, and in Charlottesville, as you recall, were people who marched with tiki torches from Lowe's department store, I guess. Both silly and terrifying. But their argument was, again, back to the Civil War, we want these statues to stay up of these Civil War, quote, heroes who fought for the lost cause. We want that. And quite frankly, and if you listen to them, they'll say this very boldly. This is not a secret. They believe that this experiment in a multicultural democracy has failed. The idea of Polish people and Slavs and Black folk and Romanians all living together, this has failed. These Black people are animals, so goes their thesis. Hispanic Latinx people, animals, right? More of them are coming into the country. And we tried. We set them free after the Civil War. We gave them the right to vote, but they can't do it. So it's that same moment in The Birth of a Nation, right? Of the legislature and the Black folk with their feet on the desk and the fried chicken. And we tried. And so now we have to separate back out. They are these people carrying those torches in this country in 2017, 1 year after the birth of Andy's podcast. Their argument is that we need to separate back out. How on God's green earth do you make a movie called Civil War? Ignore all of that. And here's the thing. I'm not even asking for them to make a movie where they address any of that. I don't think they should have made this movie. They could have made any other movie. They chose this. Why?
It sounds like you think when we're thinking about the upsides and downsides of the movie, you think the downsides are so overwhelmingly high that this movie should never have been made. I just want to put a finer point on it for listeners. Does putting a Civil War on the big screen, because there's some pretty provocative images in here. I mean, the Lincoln Memorial, this is in the trailer, the Lincoln Memorial gets blown up. You see helicopters swooping down on Washington. There's a lot of things in here that seem pretty upsetting. Does and James, I think this is going to tie a little bit back into the research you've shared with us already. But does dramatizing an American Civil War, again set tomorrow, basically, in the environment we're in today, does this sort of risk manifesting the dystopian to reality, or do we think that maybe it's the conversation, the power of positive conversation, can outweigh those risks?
I don't think we as a nation necessarily need any help in that regard. You know what I mean? Like, we're going there on our own. We don't really need movies to propel us forward there. So I'll give the film grace there. I do feel like it, more than anything, I think it, the weight of the responsibility, here with movies like this, are again, just to provide hopefully provide some kind of discourse. I think the film is anti-war. I do feel like it's against it. I do think by the end of the movie, like I did feel like what semblance of a objective that it has is that this was really fucking bad.
Yeah.
And we don't want this to happen, but the question is like how did we get there? Who is to blame? And what, you know what I mean? Like, how did this all manifest is kind of removed from the story. And I think that's where it falters for me. But I do think like the message at the end of the film is that things could get really terrible, and what are we doing to contribute to this violence, and what are we doing to prevent it?
So the conversation, you think the film provides a conversation for us to have,
Yes,
hopefully across political lines, in terms of people who have different backgrounds than we do, for example. Andy, anything you want to add?
I have a couple of data points that I think are helpful, maybe for your listeners who don't spend their days looking at spreadsheets of voter data the way that I do, but just because I think it's interesting and provides perhaps some helpful context even for this film. James was talking about the state of Oregon. Just for context, and James, I don't know if you know this, but in the last election in 2020, there were about 1.3 million votes for Joe Biden in Oregon and about 960,000 votes for Trump. So we think of Oregon as being a blue state, and it is much closer together than many other states. It's much more purple. California, when I alluded to earlier, I think part of the reason that the director chose California to partner with Texas is that in the 2020 election, California cast more individual votes for Donald Trump than any other state. More Californians voted for Trump than Texans. Some of that's because California is a really populous state, right? But there were 6 million votes there. And so I think I'd say those two numbers, one, to help us all remember that America is much more nuanced than the red and blue maps we see on election coverage, right?
Yeah.
Those maps, if one more person voted for this guy than the other guy, that map turns a certain color, but that does not reflect the actual political leanings of the people in that state. And that simplicity on election night, I think, it loses all nuance, and that shapes how we view our state. Even in Oklahoma, right? You see the map of all 77 counties and they go red or blue, and that is not remotely reflective of the population in those counties, nor the partisanship of the votes cast, right? We have counties with 7,000 people and counties with 700,000 people, and they're the same size on the map, and people think they're all equal, and that's not how it is. Back to the film itself, I want Americans to walk away who see it and say, whoa, war is hell. We should do everything we can to avoid it. But I also, Caleb, want at least our listeners to recognize that the most likely outcome, if America were to go to some kind of war with itself, and God, I hope we don't. But if we do, the war that is portrayed in this film is unlikely, right? We are much more likely to have a Balkanization, or a Northern Ireland,
Yep.
the Troubles, right? Where events like the Murrah building bombing,
Yep.
or car bombs,
Yep.
or mass shootings, things we are already starting to see, but where those become much more commonplace, and we all live in an even higher state of anxiety than we have right now, which is untenable and difficult to even imagine. And that's when I think about my kids, that's not the future I want for them. And so whatever's in this film is portrayed. This is why I said with the jets flying over and the Lincoln Memorial, being blown up. Well, that makes me think of like Independence Day when they like visually blew up the White House for the effect. Okay. I'm much less concerned with the Lincoln Memorial, which I adore. I don't want it blown up. I'm much less concerned with it being blown up than wondering if the restaurant I'm having dinner in is going to be car bombed by someone that disagrees, right? Like we have liberal leaning coffee shops and more conservative leaning smoothie bars or whatever. And like, if the other side decided they were going to have that kind of violence, that is it's not really a hot war, right? It's not really a cold war. It's that in between that I think are just on a political level, like our current division in our country, where we are reluctant or refusing to even engage with others who disagree, sometimes for righteous reasons, but sometimes just because we're petty. If we give into that and we don't work to build those relationships, then that is a possible future, right? That for America that we haven't.
It's
seen.
happening in Congress, so it's like where you see it. We see the head in the sand. Like, I'm not doing anything. It doesn't matter if I even partially agree with you because you're doing it. I'm not going to agree. I'm not going to vote on it, and which is a detriment.
Well, you even see the speakers of the House who even have to. I mean, even ones that I didn't like or the other party liked, whatever. Because they were willing to have a conversation with political opponents, they were ousted, right?
Yeah. I mean, Oklahoma Senator James Lankford, right? Like, I saw him at the airport last month, and he looked rather defeated shortly after the vote where he was defeated for trying to pass a bill with Democratic support that Democrats would have never agreed to like 2 years ago. And his own party was like, nope, like you did a deal with them and we're going to cut you off. And it's like, okay, well, if we're having an absolute like line in the sand, not going to work with the other side, if members of Congress, which are not representative of the people of the United States, but if members of Congress set that and model that behavior, and Americans out here in the streets adopt that kind of behavior, that's a path towards hardcore division that we can and hopefully should avoid.
Right. I think that the way this film, when you put it in that context, absolutely is a more Hollywood version of it. But for listeners, imagine more just civil unrest. That with random outbursts of violence at anywhere. It's a good way to paint that picture, I think. Well, we're going to head into the review section here, but I think a big takeaway from this very lengthy, in-depth pre-review conversation I wanted to have was just so listeners could be thinking about, what does this movie mean? Should I even consider seeing it outside of the fact that we're going to review whether it's good or bad? Just the fact that it is a movie being put out. How should you think about approaching and processing it? And the last thing I want to make sure we make very clear is that there are ways to get more engaged in your communities, to ensure that you are working to build bridges or drive awareness of what laws are actually being discussed. So I want to turn it to you, Andy, and then James. How can people get more connected and engaged with their local communities?
Sure. Thanks. 100%. Like, I know I've been kind of doom and gloom about this, but the fact is we're not in a civil war. We still have plenty of exits to take as a country, and each and every one of us have the chance to take an exit today. With Let's Fix This, with my organization, we have a number of volunteer opportunities to help in a nonpartisan way engage with folks, people you know, and with strangers, whether it's just registering people to vote. We have the lowest voter participation in the country. I would love to change that. We have immense opportunity to do that. So if you like standing at tables at festivals, that's a great way to do it. We have opportunities for phone banking, text banking, knocking on doors, even of your neighbors. You don't have to go talk to strangers. You can talk to your friends and family or people who live around you. What we're really trying this year in particular are really trying to build a community around civic engagement. Like I would call them civic heroes, which I know is a little Pollyannish, but people who are willing to say, hey, this matters a lot. And this is something that as a country, we've been moving away from for participation in kind of the civic life. Aside from voting, there's lots of other ways to contribute. And so we have that. You can go to our website, letsfixthis.org, and click on, there's a tab for Get Involved. That's a great way to get involved. In fact, we have some training opportunities or volunteer onboarding opportunities coming up in the next couple of weeks. And then if you're outside Oklahoma or even if you're here, I've got some colleagues at the national level with an organization called the Listen First Coalition. If you just Google Listen First Coalition, they host an annual event, and it's coming up, I think, later this month, called the National Week of Conversation. Their whole setup is promoting and like facilitating conversation between people that come to that conversation from different political ideologies, right? So they try to match you up, and they give you a prompt, and they help you facilitate conversation. It's all virtual, which is pretty cool because you do get a chance to talk to people like in Oregon or other states. It's not the same as like sitting, across the podcast desk from them. But my hope is that people participate in it and kind of get some confidence to have conversations. It is not adversarial. It is really people approaching it in a spirit of like, hey, we need to build some bridges here. So they're great. There's other groups, Unify, YOU, NIFI, is one that does kind of a similar thing, focused on youth. But there are lots of, I think, groups out there that are promoting and actively working towards a more like conciliatory, like fostering reconciliation among us, like in our communities. And I think it's a really important long-term thing. And I'll end by saying, like, democracy is messy. It is hard. I think people who see violence as an option is, and James, when you're talking about the Charlottesville March, it made me think of this, that a lot of folks there feel like we've tried this multicultural democracy, and it's not even that it doesn't work. It's just like, I'm sick of trying. Like, it's hard. Can't we just be homogenous and like do our own thing? And if you're, just don't give up on democracy is my ask, right? Like, it is worth, this country is great because we have made it that way, because we have embraced America as a melting pot, because we have embraced people who disagree with us. Sometimes we learn from them, but it takes some sense of humility on our point, on our own, and a commitment to working towards the future and doing the right thing. So,
well said.
Go democracy.
Yay, go team. We're all team democracy at this table.
Yes.
So, Andy, well said. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure finally having an opportunity to sit down and talk a movie with you. Next time, I'll make sure it's a movie that you've had time to see before we get to review it.
I'll make a point to make sure I see the movie. So thanks so much for having me, Caleb.
No, you're good. You were saved. Trust me.
Well, James, on that note, again, city council level, what would you say? What are some ways that listeners can get more engaged?
Well, so here's the bad news first. PBS did a poll recently where they asked, do Americans have to resort to violence to get their country back on track? 1 in 5 Americans say yes.
Ooh, that is bad news.
So to dig down deeper, 12% of Democrats say yes, we would need to resort to violence to get the country back on track. 87% disagree. 28% of Republicans agree with that sentiment. 70% say no. And 18% of independents, right? So that's the bad news. I also just did a quick little, look at the tracking for the box office for Civil War, to your question of like, what's the, what role could this movie play? And so far it made $2.9 million, to which I unfortunately contributed to last night.
A24's biggest Thursday night previews of all time.
That's what it's projected right now, is to make around 20 million this weekend. Could be as high as 24 million. A24 would be really funny if it got 24 million. And then as low as 15 million. I made that reference to Birth of a Nation earlier, and I think in some ways it's hyperbolic, because I to Laurent's point, I actually don't see this movie inspiring people to take up arms. Like, I would not give this movie that much credit. I think this tendency, as those poll numbers demonstrate that people are already, look at January 6th, right? And the mass shootings, etc. So I don't think it has that power. I think this movie exists in a long line of Hollywood films in this country that have glorified violence as conflict resolution. So it's been priming us for this already. So I would never give this movie that credit. I just think it's a stupid, irresponsible film and intellectually vapid. truly intellectually vapid. Speaking of the opposite of intellectually vapid, I think start local. Of course, I would say that as the city council person, but Oklahoma City is, in terms of its government, is nonpartisan. So when we run for office, we don't run as a Democrat. We don't run as an independent. We don't run as a Republican. You just run, right? And so when our names appear on the ballot, it doesn't have a D or an R or an I next to our name. It's just your name, right? And the way I won was literally going to neighborhoods like the one we're in right now, right? Or in Andy's neighborhood in Cleveland, and just being like, "Hey, hi, what are the concerns in your neighborhood? What are your hopes for our city?" And I took notes, and then I used those notes to craft policy. And so I think knocking doors as a volunteer for a city council campaign or knocking doors as a candidate widens your perspective. It gets you out of your head, gets you out of your neighborhood, and you meet people who might not see the world the same way you do. In fact, they can't see the same world, the world the way that you do, because they're not you, right? And moreover, if they're not in your neighborhood, they're not in the same vantage point as you are. So it truly widens your perspective. I always find it funny when people are like, I'm a more progressive person, and they'll be like, "Oh, James is in his bubble with his progressive values." Like, try again, buddy. I have spoken to some of the most hardcore right-wing Republicans with Trump stickers on their door and Second Amendment stuff on their truck, but I will talk to them, within reason, right? But I have listened to people share deep state conspiracy theories with me at their door and talk at me for 15 minutes. And then finally, when they're like, "So what about you?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, hi, thanks. I'm still here, and I'm working on putting a sidewalk on Northwest Expressway." and they're like, "What? Like, so that's what you're going to do in the face of, reptiles being secretly?" And I was like, "Hey, I'll tell you what, you worry about that and let me worry about the sidewalk." And literally I had a guy go, "Well, actually that makes sense." And I was like, "Okay, I'm glad that somehow made sense to you." But I think the local level is what you do. And I would just encourage you, if you live in Oklahoma City, to Google Maps for our penny sales tax to see about the 16 projects that are coming online. There are still opportunities to add your voice to how to shape those projects, from public transit to neighborhood parks. I would also Google, as boring as it sounds, OKC 2017 bond ballot, and look at what the last ballot looked like for the city's infrastructure bond election, because we'll have another one next year, and you can shape that by looking around your neighborhood and going, "What do we need?" or talking to your neighbors. So I just think that the city level engagement's really the way to go. I can't help the state or the federal government.
Well, and also the city, that's the thing that people are going to experience day in and day out. I know it, like, especially with the way the media presents it, we love to talk about the national media, and it's important for sure. But I mean, in terms of what's going to affect the day-to-day of people in their everyday life, it's their city governments, their local governments, right? Showing up to all those elections you forgot are happening because it's national news talking about it, right?
And you feel empowered as a voter. Because I can tell you, just today, as I was meeting with merchants in the Paseo for their Paseo merchant meeting, the bond from 2017 that voters approved, that voters, as the city was crafting that bond, they did outreach to the different 8 city council wards, and they asked them, "What do you need in your neighborhood? What is the big totality of projects?" And people said, "We'd love to see a revitalization of the Paseo." Well, that made it onto the bond. Voters approved that bond. And now when voters see me as the council person walking around the Paseo or posting photo updates on Instagram of the Paseo, when I say empower, it's not abstract. It literally, they get to say, "Oh my gosh, the vote I made when I voted for the bond and for Ed Shadid, my predecessor, who was the council person at that time, and then me, the council person who said, I will steward that package of projects." They go, "Okay, I might not be able to get my arms wrapped around what's happening at the federal level and the inaction in Congress or at the legislative level, but look, I did something." And then it gives me the ability to say, well, if you like this bond project, stick around, because those MAPS penny sales tax projects, those are going to start happening over the next 10 years. And when you voted for me and you voted for MAPS, you are now going to see the results. And so at the city level, I think there's a sense of agency and collective, like we're in this together as Republicans and independents and Democrats. And I know that sounds cheesy, but it is the only thing that keeps me grounded in like sanity right now. So no, I think you just get involved at the local level. You follow what's happening. You vote in those elections. You volunteer for campaigns when you can, or you run for office.
And yes, that means you got to watch the city council meetings, right?
I don't know if I.
Maybe just read the cliff notes. Well, hey, it's been so much fun. Listeners, I know this was sort of a special edition, but thanks for tuning into this very lengthy, in-depth discussion just related to what a film like Civil War means. If you have any thoughts or feedback on this, let us know. Email us at thecinematropolis@gmail.com or hit us up on any of our social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, at the Cinematrop or the Cinematropolis. With that said, let's finally get into our spoiler-free reviews of Civil War.
19 states have seceded.
The United States Army ramps up activity.
The White House issued warnings to the Western forces as well as the Florida Alliance.
The three-term president assures the uprising will be dealt with swiftly.
Let me know if you want to try anything on.
I guess aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America.
We just try to stay out. With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
Citizens of America. The so-called Western forces of Texas and California have suffered a very great defeat at the hands of the United States military.
Mr. President, do you regret the use of airstrikes against American citizens?
So according to IMDb, Civil War is described as a journey across a dystopian future America following a team of military-embedded journalists as they race against time to reach D.C. before rebel factions descend upon the White House. So a couple of fun facts to provide a little bit of context about this film. This is the fourth film directed by Alex Garland following his debut film Ex Machina in 2014, Annihilation in 2018, and Men in 2022. He also served as the writer, director, executive producer, and creator of the FX series Devs, starring Nick Offerman. Might be one of my favorite things he's made. He also said that he's taking a break from directing following this film. So he's going, yes, you said you like 28 Days Later. Well, guess what? He's going back to work on 28 years later on screenwriting. This film held its world premiere at South by Southwest on March 14th, 2024, and received rave reviews out the gate that have cooled somewhat. Now has an 84% on Rotten Tomatoes as of this recording. Now we're recording this before CinemaScore comes out. I'm really curious about audience reactions to this film. The Civil War stars Kirsten Dunst, Wagner Moura, Kaylee Spaney, I hope I'm saying that right, Stephen McKinley Henderson, Nick Offerman, and one of Alex Garland's regulars, Sonoya Mizuno, among many others. So, James, you've already kind of tipped your hand a little bit here, so I'll just we'll just let you get just jump right into it. You can pull off the gauntlets. What did you think about this movie overall?
Have y'all ever seen Mortal Kombat Annihilation?
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that as like a 15-year-old in the theater.
Annihilate all expectations, the tagline. Yeah.
Oh my God. That's a great tagline. That was a movie that I watched for it was one of the first experiences I remember going, oh my God, a major studio just made a movie that is horrible, like just nearly incoherent. And that's how I feel about this film. Like, I cannot stress to you enough. Like, I was so bored, like setting aside the politics, which I do ultimately think feed into part of the reason why this movie is boring. Like, I just kept the whole time watching it, waiting for the Cloverfield monster to show up to at least give me some sort of antagonist, some sort of tension. Like the description you just read of they're racing against. No, they're not. No one's racing against anything.
They're in a car a lot.
They're in a car moving slowly to, I guess, get to the president so they can interview him. Woo, riveting. Like, it was so boring. And I hesitate to throw around this verb. I hated this movie. I almost got up and left this movie. And the only reason I did not leave this movie is because I was like, I have to be on this podcast.
Thank you for suffering.
It is truly one of the most boring films I have ever watched. I don't think this movie, it's even if you set aside its politics, it is just, you have two white women as your protagonist. And I'm supposed to feel what? Like some sort of sadness for them? What? Why? Who? Oh my God, you're making a movie called Civil War and a black character is not your main character. A Native American character is not your main character. These two white women are your main characters. You know, the very white female body that's been used time and time again as justification for why we should genocide Native Americans, enslave black people, keep them from the right to vote, segregate them for 100 years after the Civil War. And your movie is going to make the protagonist not one, but two white women, where the arc is that the younger white woman learns a valuable lesson from the older white woman, who also learns a valuable lesson from her younger mirror self.
Well,
what?
Well,
oh my God. I have seen 700 movies since this time 2020. I've been keeping a list for the first time in my life. I cannot think of one of those movies that I wanted to just turn off and stop watching. And that's how I felt about this. I just wanted it to stop. One guy yawned loudly twice and he's like, brother, solidarity.
So James Cooper, not a fan, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's a lot of reasons we'll get into about you didn't like it. But at the end of the day, even as just a ride, it was boring.
Like literally just entertain me. I promise anyone listening right now, I'm not going into something wanting to hate it. I'm going in wanting to be entertained. And this movie,
Ron Chapman, I'm going to turn to you next. What did you think of Civil War?
I was like, as is typical in a Civil War, there are two opposing sides to the conflict here. I respect James Cooper's perspective on it, and he has given me a lot of food for thought to think about that the film did not provide. But I do think that me being a huge fan of genre films, and Alex Garland being in this kind of, like you said, you mentioned kind of artsy-fartsy blockbuster films, but most of ones that I've liked more than not. Men wasn't a favorite of mine, but in general, I've liked his work.
I'd say three out of four of his projects.
Three out of four of his projects I've at least liked.
Right.
You know, Annihilation being the one I like probably the most. I'm not really including the 28 Days series, but yes, that obviously, I was
referencing Devs, the TV show, because he was very integral, like creatively on that one. I think he might have directed an episode, but he was writing and all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah. But I think in regards to this movie, I do think that that it did provide me with the base level of what you're saying, what James is saying, and that he didn't get from it was my issues with it is that it didn't provide enough political discourse for me to chew on. And as much as I dreaded a movie that was going to hammer down the point to where it was just super didactic and just like, give me a break, we get it. Like, just even if I agreed with what it was saying, you know what I mean? Like it being so unsubtle in its messaging that it would just be like, you want to take a bath afterwards. But I did think it did at least work as a thriller. You know what I mean? Like as I did think it sustained tension very well. There were several individual moments in the film that I did gasp or kind of scream, or not scream, but you know what I mean? Like have a visceral reaction to. So I did think it worked in terms of that, in terms of form. And I'm a huge Kirsten Dunst fan. So, I mean, anything she's in, I'm probably going to be a little bit biased about, but I don't know if she needed to be the protagonist of this movie. But I do think that it was, I did think that her and Kaylee Spinney had a good, chemistry together.
Again, getting into the who who they chose to write the main character, I did think that the core group had enough of a chemistry that I could really
Was it
relate
Wagner?
to.
It was Wagner. Yeah, we already said his name.
The guy from Narcos. That guy.
Yes. I did enjoy him, and then the character actor whose name has escaped me.
Is in every single one of Garland's projects.
Exactly. He was in Dune recently.
Yeah.
Love that actor and thought he was great. Would have loved a little bit more with him, but I thought he was great as well. So I think it's one of those things where my issue is with the objective of the film. The objective, I'm not sure I know what it is, because the film, again, tries to take a step back from really hammering in on having a point of view. But I did think it worked as a genre film. And in that regard, I did have at least pure entertainment value out of that aspect of it. But I don't know if that's good or bad. So.
Yeah, so I'm going to, in terms of this movie, removing the context in which it's released and all the things we've already talked about and things we'll talk about in spoilers, I found, like you, Laurent, there were several sequences, especially in the last 25 minutes, that it really did have me kind of really engrossed and on the edge of my seat. That said, I do think the first 2/3 of this movie are largely significantly slower than you would expect from a movie called Civil War, especially given how they've marketed the film. It's a slow burn until suddenly it's not, at least in my opinion. The part that's not a slow burn is a great ride. It's like a ride through hell, triggering, thinking about, oh gosh, if a civil war happened, seeing the collapse of Washington, all of that stuff is pretty provocative in a certain way, especially right now. And the way that they set the film, it's technically the future, but it's the future that is, I keep saying, like, basically tomorrow.
Yeah, it doesn't feel out of reach.
No,
it doesn't feel out of reach. Where there's vague implications that feel very rooted in the current climate, even though it doesn't explicitly say so.
I thought the sequence with Jesse Plemons, who is credited as unnamed soldier, I thought was very, very effective.
Yeah.
I thought that entire sequence is probably the standout outside of maybe the last 20 minutes that I thought was pretty powerful. But again, the first, I don't know, thankfully the movie was under 2 hours, but say the first hour, it's a real slow burn. I think the best thing I got out of it was I kind of liked the characters enough. But I also think that because there's no political it's not really a political film. You're just kind of following them around as they go from town to town and take photographs. And that's either your cup of tea or it's not. And I don't think it was my cup of tea overall. I think the movie's okay. As a genre exercise, my bigger problem with it is, okay, I think James kind of alluded to it. You're putting this film out now, and though I think there are some pros in terms of the quality, things I enjoyed about it, are those worth just making this movie and putting it out right now? I don't think, if you're going to make a movie called Civil War and you put it out in an election year, you better have some really strong convictions about something. And this movie does not. I think at best you could say it's an anti-war film, but I don't even know if it's clear that it is an anti-war film. I think there's a way to read it as that, but I don't think the movie is clear about it. I mean, I don't know, Laurent, you and I seem like we're bigger Alex Garland fans than James. I mean, how would you compare this to his past films in terms of what works or doesn't?
It's probably more accessible. It definitely feels more grounded, because a lot of his stuff is a little bit more, it dabbles in the supernatural kind of, and he likes dealing somewhat in abstractions, particularly with like Annihilation and the last 15 minutes of Men.
What a ride.
It was in a movie that was, very ordinary until it really wasn't. And then you're like, well, what was that about? The ending seems to be polarizing there. But that's something he always plays with. There's always is that thing that he does in every movie where it's normal until it's not. And then, or he'll take something very familiar and then, I will say pervert it, but you know what I mean? Like abstract it in some sort of way where, something terrifying like an Annihilation with the bear.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
nightmare fuel.
The nightmare fuel. And then all of a sudden it's screaming. The voices are the victim. That's terrifying because it's like you're conflating these two things that you're not used to seeing merged together, and that's terrifying imagery. He's really good at generating those kinds of visuals, And I think that in a certain way, that's here, but in a way that feels more like, again, tangible and not existing in some fantasy.
It's kind of the Hollywoodized version of a Civil War
like
type
what
thing.
does a Civil War look like if it was outside your door and you can't go to the gas station without people holding AR-15s? Like that's a terrifying concept. Like have the threat of violence everywhere you go. So I think that it works on that level, but I just think I wish it engaged a little bit more with its ideas than simply just presenting them.
James, anything to add about maybe the differences in his previous works?
Well, I think that bear stuff's great. I forgot about that. It's so uncomfortable.
Hey, goosebumps, honestly, right now.
Mm-hmm. I just find him a lackluster filmmaker. Like, I can't stress enough. I think his scripts work with 28 Days Later. That is truly one of cinema's greatest films. Like, and I think it's a film we should always talk about because of that kind of cusp between film and digital and the way it was released, right? Like, I remember a friend of mine when we were at OCCC in film production school together, somehow had secured a copy of that film before it came out. And we were able to watch it projected in his backyard. And it just felt so like a mixture of like avant-garde filmmaking. It felt guerrilla. Like, remember the opening of just like, that character in the middle of a deserted.
The zombies are so vicious and you get all in your face. And
yeah. And it's truly just one of my favorite films, but like Ex Machina to me has ideas, but I think that movie is unintentionally, I think he thinks that movie is about her, like and about women, but it is absolutely not. It is about that male protagonist, and he's using this female body to tell that story. And I find stories like that just always offensive. And Annihilation's fine. Like, it's neither here nor there sort of thing.
Men, you didn't see Men, yeah.
And I didn't see Men, so I can't speak to. I haven't seen Debs.
Okay, all right.
I don't know.
But have you played the video games he's worked on? No, he has. I haven't, but he has apparently worked on video games.
Did he write 28 Weeks Later?
I think he was a producer on that. Let me fact check though. But he was a producer. I don't think he wrote that.
Because I didn't really care for that one, though it had some moments that were kind of okay.
That one was a little more on the nose in terms of the war in Iraq parallels were very obvious, whereas I don't think it was quite as on the nose with the previous film. No, he did not write the screenplay.
He is absolved.
I think the last thing I want to, in the spoiler-free section, ask, how successfully does Civil War explore the idea of a near-future collapse of the U.S. government? Because I will say that's one of the things that I don't think the film's about very much, honestly. But one of the things that I took away from is I do think it wants you to understand that this is very bad. Like, the stuff that's happening is awful. There's one point, there's like a mass grave of clearly civilians. You're like, yeah, that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And even the last sequences, it's very intense. You're seeing these giant tanks driving around the city like it's a normal thing. My take was, he wants you to feel like if a civil war actually happened basically tomorrow, what would that look like? And it's uncomfortable.
What would it look like to be in Gaza and not just watch it on TV and be removed from it? Like, what does that? What is bullets firing everywhere constantly in the background of what does that look like? I do think it does realize that.
That stuff work for you, Laurent?
I think so. I think it does create a sense of dread. That was the thing I got. It's like everything is working for me on a technical level.
Right.
Everything is there. Like, the framework is there. I just think the insight is not, that's the thing, is I found myself like reaching for, like, again, who's to blame here? Like, what are you saying? Like, what are the ideas I'm supposed to leave with when I see this? Because I can see this and see this is horrific. It looks bad, but like beyond that, it's kind of hard to glean a lot, And I'm not saying that he didn't have an intention. It's just that it's like he made a conscious choice not to engage with it, so as to maybe not polarize everybody, But in doing so, maybe maybe you kind of hurt your film a little bit, So.
Mm-hmm. James, did any of that stuff work for you at all in terms of the creating a war-torn America?
No. I can't stress enough. Like, to me, this is, and I'm not trying to be purposely like antagonistic toward him being Alex Garland. it's rare the feeling I have toward this film. It truly, because I'm a big mystery science theater person and riff tracks. Like I love bad movies. Like I truly like Manos Hands of Fate, or what's the one? Hi Mark, The Room, or something like that. Things like this I think are wonderful. I truly love. For me, I either need a terrible film that I can find some enjoyment in, or I need a great film. But middling is, like, why? We have so much to do in our lives, up to and including laying in flowers, and I was just looking at my list of just my favorite films through the years. And I think what's missing from this film in so many ways, like, remember Mad Max Fury Road?
One of the best.
Put that movie out this year. Like, what happens when that movie comes out this year? That movie is saying something politically without ever talking about any of the literal political issues of our times. But it's ultimately a story about women's autonomy, right? Agency. It's about tyrants, right? It's about who has control over their own bodies in this sort of way. That movie is saying something, but you almost don't know it because the movie just moves at this rapid pace. Every single shot matters. That movie is a thrill ride, and had Spotlight not come out that year, it would have been the best film of the year, just clearly. I don't even think that's debatable. So for me, like, I put that up against this film and I'm just like, well, what are we doing? Like, this is just like a slog. And then it was also a movie that just randomly, when I was looking at my best films list through the years, like, why not shoot this film similarly to like Darren Aronofsky's like The Wrestler? Why not do something like a bit grittier and handheld? Like, there was a moment, and I don't know this will stand out at all to anyone else watching this film, but there was a moment for me that just really caught my eye. It's when it's early in the film and they're driving the streets of whatever city, and the Kirsten Dunst character is like, that same look that almost never leaves her face throughout the whole film. Scowl, sadness look that only breaks once when she smile, wearing a pretty dress. Smile.
It's a great moment. Come on.
But but she's looking at apartments like along the street. And one of the things I kept thinking as that moment happened, I was like, maybe it's because I just got back from San Francisco from a homelessness conference last month or whatever, or Austin last month, or earlier this month. People really live in those buildings. Like, real people live in those buildings. And this movie just scoots right past all of them. If you had a camera like the way Aronofsky uses his in The Wrestler, that's down at that ground level beside people, almost like in an over-the-shoulder kind of way, I think there would have been a realism and a grit to this story that a story like this demands. Andy nailed it earlier. Like, should something like this happen in our country, it will look like what the insurrection looked like. It will look sloppy, right? People almost not knowing what they're doing, but knowing what they're doing. It will be suicide bombers like we saw in Iraq. It'll be, remember, they were using improvised weapons, right? Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, right? Like, that's what would happen here. It would be your everyday people who have AKs and ARs and whatever other letters of the alphabet, makeshift bombs like McVeigh did in Oklahoma City. Like, it'll be sloppy and mean and personal at that level. And this movie just completely misses all of that, all of it. And then I would just conclude by saying, I think, wait, are we in the spoiler part yet?
Not quite.
yet.
Almost.
Okay. Almost.
I mean, to your point, though, you really don't get any sense of the president in this movie. I mean, yes, he's a tyrant, but it's only because the movie, the tell, don't show, We just are told he's in his third term. He's a bad dude. But you really don't understand why people hate him in any way. I mean, like, what are the political reasons? What are the personal reasons you point out?
Right.
Because this movie is the opposite of personal. at pretty much every turn. I agree. Well, with that said, what letter grades do we give the film? Hold on. James, you can go first. Just start us off the bat.
I think it's an F. Like, I just think this is literally one of the worst movies I have ever seen in my life.
Wow.
Ever. Like, indefensibly bad.
The thing is, I don't agree, but I do at the same time. I think technically the technical part is what saves it for me. But I also think ideologically and all these points in the history that you're bringing forward are all extremely valid. So it kind of makes you feel like this movie could have, if they were going to make it, that's what I'm saying. If they were going to make this movie, they needed to have done their homework, had something to say, and make it mean something.
Because again, I think it was either before the episode or during the episode, I think Laurent mentioned like the Planet of the Apes films. And like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is saying something politically without actually saying these sorts of words. It's like, and it's the technical achievement also in that film. I don't know how, to me, it's just like these movies are like night and day, but they're both trying to ultimately say something about society and conflict and how we can lose civility. Like, but Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, I would watch, even though it's so painful to watch. I'd watch that infinitely more. I will never watch this movie again. You couldn't pay me.
Oh wow, Laurent Chapman, could I pay you to watch this again?
I give this film a B. I'm coming to this like definitely had, and I would say this was a B plus before we talked. So you brought me down half a star, but you brought me down half a star with those points. But I have to stand by my convictions and say that I did enjoy it. It's not really the word, but I did find it effective in certain ways, in certain craftsmanship sort of ways. And I don't think that those things are meritless. You know what I mean? In terms of, and so I will say that on that level, as a genre exercise, I did think it was effective. I just wish there was a little bit more to chew on. So I'll say that a B seems fair in where I'm landing with it right now.
I'm going to go with the C. I'm going to split the difference. I like Alex Garland. I don't like this movie enough to want to go back to it. I don't like Men enough to want to go back to it. So it's just kind of mediocre, even though I think there are components, especially Laurent, the craft, the technical, the last 20 minutes, I'm on the edge of my seat, just being that close to the action. That's pretty powerful stuff, I think. Just the urgency. And similarly, we talked about the insurrection a couple times. In the final sequence, there is a distinct feeling similar to the insurrection where you're like, these people are in a place they shouldn't be doing a thing you never thought you'd see them do in this spot. And it's a little uncomfortable. And that stuff works for me.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't really think it means anything is the problem. And with that, I can't give it anything higher than a C. It's just an okay movie.
Do you know who did? I was just looking at the reviews earlier. Did you see the AV Club gave it an A?
An A?
An A.
Wow.
An A minus is flat out an A.
The response generally is even 84. You said it's cooled down to 84. So
that's still a good review.
That's good reception. You know what I mean, for a film, so.
And again, I think there's thrilling enough elements in here that you could go in, watch it, and say you had a good time. I do agree, though, with James. The first hour is very slow. With that said, what other things would you recommend, maybe instead of, or to go along with Civil War? That could be film, television, novel, music, video games, what have you. And Laurent Chapman, I'll throw it back to you.
Children of Men comes to mind. And The Road, I like the book and the film. But I think I like the book more. Those are two films dealing with kind of dystopian worlds that I do think asks us a lot of questions of the audience, and has us engage with everything that's happening without feeling like it has to like guide our hand through it. So I think those are two recommendations I'd give for people who like this film or like something that adjacent to what this film is trying to do.
I think the novel is our borderline masterpiece, at least for sure. James?
Yeah, I'm actually going to stick with the ones I've already recommended. I think going back and watching Mad Max Fury Road or Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and asking yourself, like, well, wait, what do these images really represent here? Like, what's going on here? And suddenly with Fury Road, you start realizing, like, wait, this is a movie about what happens when hypermasculinity reaches its obvious conclusions, right? Of dominance, right? And childlike irresponsibility. And I think Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is also dealing with similar questions about dominance and trust. And I just think it's one, and also the ability to, we talk about conflict resolution. There is a moment in that film that I'll never forget where one of the apes is traumatized from what happened in the first film and wants revenge for it, right? Violence. And the main ape character looks at him and goes, future. Like, tries to get, I think that's the word. I could be wrong. I think that's the word he uses there. You saw it.
You're right. I just saw it recently. Yeah, you're right.
Future. And it is, as a former middle school teacher, I realized immediately what was happening there. It was this moment where Caesar, I think is the character.
Caesar, yeah.
Is trying to explain to him, like, I know our emotions, right? And I believe Abraham Lincoln spoke like this. Our passions may have strained, right? It's like, I know our emotions can get the better of us and make us want to behave certain ways. But we have to have self-awareness enough in those moments to go, wait, what are the future consequences if I just act without reflection? That is in a summer blockbuster with a huge budget and incredible special effects. And I think if you really want to get at some of the roots of conflict, that's the story I'd go for.
It's a great recommendation, considering we are going to be doing a review for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes in May. So get hyped there. I also had Children of Men down. I think that's a great recommendation in terms of, like, just really, that is a really gritty war movie. I don't think this movie, that is Civil War, gets nearly as gritty as Children of Men, but I think that's a much better example. And you really get in it with the characters, thanks to a lot of the incredible camera work. On the more fun side of The End of the World, on Amazon, just released this last week. Big fan of the Fallout video games. Huge fan. And the TV show is out. I've only watched the first episode, but I'm very interested in what they do next. It's from the creators of Westworld. So that's Jonathan Nolan, who also co-wrote The Dark Knight, Interstellar, worked with his brother Chris, but also written Westworld with his wife, Lisa Joy. So far, again, I'm only one episode in. As a fan of the games, I'm like, ooh, you guys definitely definitely appreciate the source material. From a television perspective, it's only episode 1, but they definitely are significantly more sophisticated than most other video game shows I've seen so far, save for The Last of Us. And lastly, we haven't really talked enough about how this film stars the press as your main characters, photojournalists. So with that in mind, I would say there's movies that do have things to say about the role of journalism, because, again, I actually don't think this movie, other than the fact that he says that journalists serve a purpose, it doesn't really have anything to say about the role of journalism either, actually. In fact, I think you could walk away from this film interpreting journalism as kind of gross. I recommend All the President's Men, a classic, and The Post as a double feature. You're looking at two different perspectives on the same thing. I highly recommend. If you want to learn about what is journalism meant to the root of this country, why is it important, why do we need to protect it as an institution, as a vehicle for positive dialogues across lines in terms of party and politics, check out those movies. I think they're both really, really top-notch. With that said, let's go ahead and get into our spoiler discussion for Civil War.
That's all you wrote? 3 lousy lines?
Why would anyone need more than 3 lines? I'm describing a person, not something complicated like a wooden sailing ship or proper dovetail technique.
So I want to jump right to the end. This actually gets right to what I've been super worried about with this movie. So the movie concludes with the Western forces of California and Texas invading the White House and assassinating the president, but only after he's been on the record begging Joel, that's one of the journalists, to stop them from killing him. And then Joel basically says, once you hear him beg for his life, he says, that'll be good. And then they pop him. He's dead. And the final shot of the movie that actually develops underneath the credits is a photo of the soldiers who did the job with big, proud grins on their faces. Now, this is a very both evocative and provocative image. It's evocative because, I mean, we've seen soldiers pridefully brag about their accomplishments. So it's evocative of that. It's provocative because it's the president of the United States. My number one concern going into this movie was they were going to put stuff out that could be read either too political or not political enough. And this is where we fall in the camp of this image is frightening to me. This image is very frightening to me, that the final frame is these guys sort of glorifying violence and saying, job well done. He's a dictator. He had to go. This is gross. I find it very distasteful. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of viewers are going to think that. I think a lot of viewers are going to say, yeah, that's right. That guy was an asshole. I'm glad. Isn't that great they did that and took that photo? So that's sort of my perspective on this. I want to turn it over to you, gentlemen. Why do you think this image is so provocative, and what does the film really want us to take away from that?
I'm actually going to, this is the one idea in the movie that for me personally, I did walk away with a visceral feeling of in terms of any kind of thought of anything to think about with leaving. And it's because I think it illustrates this very empty, false sense of satisfaction that I felt at the end of that, and how at the end of the movie, we do not feel good about, I don't feel good about that.
You and I don't.
You and I do not. Someone might, but I left that thinking that it was saying something about how we used all this violence to rectify a perceived problem, or a problem that's happening all over the world. But the means we went through to try and rectify that problem, it was not solved. I still feel like there's an ongoing. Obviously,
Wait, what's the new regime going to look like?
What is it
they kill the president.
It looks now. Are we living in anarchy, or is it like? Is there no? Are we everyone running? Like, there's still people armed with weapons outside, murdering people, all over the nation. So it's like that's the sobering moment that I did think the movie got. I won't say got right, but definitely left me with something to chew on. And it's this idea that, like the problem wasn't solved, and seeing them feel like we've executed the problem, but the problem may not have just been resting just on this one person. And clearly the problem is still persistent.
We got Saddam Hussein that ended the war in Iraq,
so
right?
I guess we're done with the conflict there.
Yeah.
That the problem persists and it continues to go on. And now what are we left with, and what do we have to do? And I think that's the part. That's the aspect of this where I do think there's a grain of thought to think about moving into, like the prospect of something horrible like this happening here. That's where I do think, like, it doesn't offer a solution, but it does, in that ambiguous sort of way, leave us something to think about. You know what I mean? Like, is this really what we want? Because it could manifest to this point, but what do we gain from it?
At the end of the day, what is removing one person really going to accomplish?
Yeah.
James, what was your take on sort of this final image of the film? How did you read that?
Well, first, I'm grateful you described what happens during the credit sequence, because I only saw that photo starting to develop because I was so quickly standing up to leave. I just can't stress enough. Standing up, walking down the stairs, I glanced up and saw a photo developing. I was like, I don't care. Like, I literally don't care. I don't think Alex Garland, and this goes back to a question, I don't know if Andy or you asked it earlier about, does it matter that someone who was not American made this movie? And in this instance, yes, it does. And I think that what Garland gets so wrong, like, I'd love to know, what research did he do on the American Civil War? Like, I just want to know. Because it's almost like he doesn't know that someone assassinated Lincoln at the end of it, right? And that this country has a history, JFK, right? Someone shooting Reagan, right? Just a history of some madmen believing that the way to resolve the either a personal crisis in their life or a political crisis for the nation is to go to the top. So I don't know that Garland has researched that at all. It's not on the screen that he has. I think secondly, again, if he had done that research on the Civil War, and I'd like to know what he's done, this goes back to the lost cause, right? Like, for the South, right? They believed that this was a war. You've heard this, the war of Northern aggression. This is the federal government.
Mhm.
It's very important, that language. It's the federal government coming in and telling us Southerners that we have to give up our agrarian plantation way of life, right? And very critically, right? And by the way, I'm teaching a class right now for the first time called God in Film and Literature. So we're dealing with a lot of these issues. But specifically, I had them watch a PBS documentary on religion in America called God in America. And episode 3 is about how both the North and the South cite the Bible to justify the existence of slavery or the abolition of it, right? And so for the South, right, they read, and the episode does such a great job of literal passages that actors will read in reenactments from the good book, you know, of why it should and should not exist. And there are moments where the Southerners are literally citing, you know, Paul's sending the slave back to the master, right, as evidence, right, or obeying the master, these sorts of passages, right? So the Southerners felt they had God on their side. If you think you have God on your side and you have a president of the United States telling you you're wrong, you will believe that violence is how you end that. It is dangerous for this film to conclude with that imagery. It is truly dangerous. It is actually irresponsible.
Agreed.
It is in a long line of storytelling, even outside of film, of storytelling that this country's residents tell ourselves about why we do what we do. And so you have, I believe, 11 states, right, that seceded from the Union because of slavery, who, as soon as the war was over, the Vice President Stevens starts lying in jail, saying, it wasn't about slavery. It wasn't about slavery at all. It was about Northern aggression. You media people like to make up stuff. So we start telling a different story right then, as soon as it's over, right? And so I just think that this moment of an ending where the main villain, and this is why the politics matter, where the main villain, who we never really know why he's the villain. We know he's dissolved the FBI late in the film, but we don't know what's going on. But the characters in the film, and then ultimately the audience, will come to believe that this was the guy. We had to get him. And even if there's Alex Garland trying to make us feel, well, but what did that really solve anything? Like, no, the damage is done. The damage is done. That image is there. That is the ending of this film. I just think it's incredibly irresponsible. It suggests that this man knows nothing about this country and its history and its tendency toward believing. Well, I mean, this has 2 more real world consequences or examples. One, after this, 100 years after the Civil War, when Johnson signs the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, as you all recall, he turns famously to the people in that room and says, the Democratic Party has lost the South for a generation, because that legislation was saying to the South, they could no longer, states' rights prohibit the races intermingling in public or in private spaces. The federal government was saying that, right? So that that's why the South ever since has voted en masse for Republicans, because then Reagan comes in and campaigns in 1980, as you all recall, on states' rights. Wink, 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 right? In Philadelphia, Mississippi, there's people carrying flags, the Confederate flags, as he's giving that speech. That's a moment when Obama, the second one, Obama passes healthcare, the Affordable Care Act. And you have the same sort of like, the federal government is shoving this down our throats. Okay, well, here we go, right? You have this long legacy in this country of people believing that the president has not just power, but has abused their power toward the Southern cause, toward the cause of freedom and liberty, right? And so for this movie to kind of reinforce that, and I just see nothing on screen that seems like it's making a more complicated argument than that.
The thing I like about Alex Garland is he has a lot of provocative imagery. Even Men, which is a movie I don't like, I think he's doing stuff that I'm like, there's something here for me to chew on, and let's talk about it. This a movie this close to the real world about this topic, featuring the president of the United States, putting it out there and say, audiences discuss. That's a really great intellectual notion that you think we can all agree that it's supposed to be bad. Unfortunately, we just don't live in that world. I mean, I mentioned the Fight Club example. I mean, how many men's rights activists out there have turned the Matrix into a weird rallying call? Taxi driver, yes. Yeah, so for me, what I see is you put it out there, the genie's out of the bottle. Now you've got this image that is almost certainly going to be co-opted at some point, memed, whatever, totally used for something different than what the director intended. And I kind of went back and forth on whether I liked it or not. Is the conversation start worth the risks? And last night I was thinking, yeah, probably. After this conversation, I really don't think it is, because of the history that you laid out there, James. Sure, it's a really provocative image meant to generate conversation, but at the same time, that's an image that is absolutely going to be misused. We can move on to maybe the role of the journalists. So the main characters in Civil War are photojournalists, and one thing, and Alex Garland actually said this in some interviews as well. In the current environment, journalists are being threatened regularly, and this is not just in America, this is across the globe. And the institution of journalism is in the decline as the media industry consolidates, and just in general, trust in the institutions, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., really is on the decline overall. People just don't trust them like they used to. Remember Walter Cronkite? Everyone used to agree that he was a trustworthy guy. I don't think we have one really anymore. So how do you think Civil War presents journalism as both a noble and dire profession? Or does it at all? LaRon?
Few people know that I got a full ride scholarship to OU with a journalism scholarship, and I didn't intend to be a journalist. It's just something I knew how to do or had interest in doing. Obviously always loved film, but that was my entryway into college. And so, I wrote for the university paper while I was there. And, gradually became a little more politically engaged, as I became more aware of what was happening around the world. But, obviously not in the capacity that war photographers war journalists are doing. But I think that what kept getting hammered down in our heads, whenever we were reporting the news, was always to remain neutral. You know what I mean? Like to present the information, you know what I mean? And to try not to take it in emotion, but it's kind of hard to do that, as a human being, you know what I mean? And to have this wall between, this distance that even these characters are being asked to, like, shoot the picture. You know what I mean? Like, would you take the picture of me if you saw me get murdered in front of you?
Well, the answer we learned was yes.
The answer we learned is yes. And that's interesting because I wouldn't think you would think to do that in the moment when you're watching, you know what I'm saying? Like, and I think that, but there's I understand the necessity for, particularly in debate, hear both sides of it, find middle ground, whatever, I do think that was the approach intentionally by rooting this in, having it be journalists be the lens through which we are navigating this war-torn world. They're journalists, so therefore they're taking a neutral approach for it, and therefore the movie is as well. And therefore we're left with a lot of feelings, but not a lot of thoughts. It shows that, that they put themselves, it shows us the sacrifice, sure, that the journalists that are in these spaces that are reporting on what some of the media won't do. I mean, and that's commendable. I guess it's also showing that journalism is a noble profession, yes, but that it does come with a certain degree of sacrifice. I don't think that these characters, it would be nice to know more, about what they feel personally about what's happening around here, even amongst themselves, while they're presenting the news neutrally. I think that would have helped a lot if we had at least, if not hearing like specifically what the president and what everything's happening, at least having an dialogue about what's aching at them personally, having to deal with this and having to report these kind of dire situations that they're depicting. So
you think it does a great job at showing them like doing the job in the line of
it shows
battle,
the job,
right?
Yeah, but it would
not really saying much about that other than that's a dangerous job.
Yeah.
Yeah. James, any thoughts on how the film presents journalists?
Well, just listening to Laurent, you're reminding me like why I was tuning out of the film. So first of all, listening to you is way more compelling. To be very clear. But the film, what you just helped me realize is I think ultimately the film is a failed experiment. I think the moment it makes the decision to remove any political subtext or text, and it does both. It actually removes the subtext even, right, in these wild ways. I think the moment you do that as a filmmaker, you have now limited the sort of conversations that those characters can have. So I'm literally remembering when I think they're like in a hotel or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the four of them are kind of sitting around, or three of them. So I don't think the young girl is with them yet, or young woman, excuse me. But do you remember what they're talking about during that scene? Anybody?
They're just talking about how they're going to go get the interview, right? They're just talking about the job.
At best, and that's a plot point, right?
Yeah.
Like we're going to go to the White House, but they're not talking about anything, right?
So what you're saying is the journalists in this movie don't have a real perspective.
They don't. And I'm glad you said that language, because now you're reminding me the other part that's just like wild to me is like, it is hokey, these moments of like snap, 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 where the movie will like intervene with still images as if this were Man with the Movie Camera back, the Ziga Vertov film, where it's like you have moving images and then suddenly you have like slowed down to photography. Like it is some of the most staged, artistic looking images, those still photography moments that I have. I mean, it's just offensive. It's offensive to Gaza. It is offensive to Ukraine. It is offensive to the memory of the Civil War here, which was the first war to have photography in it. You wouldn't know even that fact from this film. I don't know how you make a film called Civil War and make photography a boring concept. Wild.
Yeah. The only thing I'm going to add on to that is again, it's tough. I do really admire that they show the photojournalist in action, just how close to the heat of battle they are and how much they really are putting their lives on the line almost as much as the soldiers in order to tell the story. However, the movie also has a lot of moments where it kind of paints it as a gross job. And what I mean is, it probably is kind of a gross job, but the takeaway from me, there's a couple of times they're taking photos and I feel gross about the nature that's almost like they're kind of showing how grisly the war is, almost fetishizing it in a way with some of the shots they showcase.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, well, I'm pro journalism.
Sure.
And it's making me feel uncomfortable that they're doing this. Does the movie want me to feel uncomfortable about the role of the journalist in this scenario? Or is it the role of war that they're capturing? But I mean, she's literally, people just died and she's already got a camera up on the dead bodies. And that probably is what the job is like. I don't know. But it does feel a little icky. And I don't know that the movie is intending that to be the case. It's a little, again, it's unclear to me. I mean, even the last shot where Kirsten Dunst goes down, it's like, wow, she makes this huge sacrifice, and all the girl can do is like flash a camera at the dead body falling on top of her. And I know there's sort of some like poetry that they're trying to go to, alluding to like the line they said earlier, but it just doesn't work in a way that makes me, okay, I'm like, what do you want me to take away about the role of journalist other than that the job is dangerous and you have to get your hands dirty? And Laurent, you can feel free to disagree. I just know that as a person who's usually pro-journalist, I was confused. So I'm assuming there's probably a lot of people who go into this movie who are not pro-journalists who are going to be like, yeah, aren't they awful people for doing this thing?
Right.
I don't know. I just am not sure what to make of it, honestly.
Yeah. Well, and also like, again, the stuff I reported on instances like this where like crimes towards, African-American bodies, that we've seen. I mean, you can put that in real world context right now, like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, that aspect of it. But things like that happening then were things I was reporting on, but also like, because no one else was, you know what I mean? And I was the sole African-American in my class that was like, does anyone care that these black kids got murdered? Like by you know what I mean? So I did feel a level of urgency and felt like it's incumbent upon me to say something about this. Like, I'm glad that whoever the main artist at the time has a new album out, but this is kind of important. You know what I mean? Like, so things like that, like So I can't begin to say that I've done anything remotely close to this. But I can imagine that if you're in that scenario, if you're putting yourself in it, like your body is also in harm. They're around bullets flying everywhere. I do think I know what you're saying. In the film, it feels almost like it's romanticizing the process.
Right.
And this is where the issue, I don't think the movie is inherently wrong. I think that removing a perspective so that we know how to feel in these moments, that's what's missing here. You know what I mean? To make those moments, that impact there. Because if we knew where Alex Garland stood on an issue, like then these moments would feel, you know what I mean? Like they would pop a little bit more, but being removed and only seeing it, then it does just feel again like an exercise of again, it's visually poetic. It looks cool from a in terms of like the way it's choreographed, and but it removes that intellectual thought, that what are we supposed to feel about this choice? Because I do think it's probably is like that. I do think they're in the heat of it. They have to capture it to avoid bullets and everything like that. But without the movie taking a political stance, we don't know how we're supposed to feel about it in those moments that it's being filmed.
Hearing you both, because I kept thinking, I was like, I have seen something that's doing this better. And it was that documentary that came out last year that I think either 20 days.
20 days. That was something else I was going to suggest too.
That movie, you don't hear that AP reporter saying like Putin's evil and but you as those images unfold, you understand how wrong what Putin is doing in Ukraine is, in those hospitals, etc. Like I just, again, it is wild to me that this film can come out during not just this election cycle, but with what's happening in Ukraine and Gaza. I don't know how Alex Garland edited this film without watching 20 Days in Mariupol and didn't feel like, oh, I got to do something about that, rethink what he's doing.
Well, it's funny, the script for this was completed in 2020, even before the insurrection. To your point, though, and you would think when you're in the editing room thinking about the images you can literally go see on TV, unfortunately, you can watch on the news,
right? Thinking
maybe I should reframe how I'm editing this. What can I do even in post-production to maybe make these moments have more impact one way or the other?
And her death, just to go to that too, because I think this is where things get very complicated, right? I think we already talked about what's wrong, problematic about the death of the president at the end. Equally problematic and concerning is the death of the Sammy character, the only Black main character in the film. Is like the kind of magical sacrificing Negro who taught us very valuable lessons about how to, live our lives, even though it's like, what lessons? This is so boring. But then her death also, right? Like stands in a long line of narratives where a white character sacrifices themselves for the Black character or for the good of the nation. Even Lincoln's death is wrapped up in a lot of that mythologizing too. Like he was the savior through his death, and this is like that. I think last time we were here talking about Halloween Ends together, and I mentioned Renee Girard's Violence in the Sacred and the scapegoating. Like Girard reminds us that is the tendency that stories in the West have, is like the death and resurrection of the sacred king, right? And that this was a divisive person when they were alive, but in their death they have united us, and so it becomes the justification for further violence. That the sacrifice is the necessary thing. Well, that's the Kirsten Dunst character. She dies, this divisive character in terms of the press, right? She dies. And while she isn't resurrected, literally as she is standing over her avatar, right? This young woman who will now literally rise up from the ground and become her new version. I mean, it's wild. And again, I think those sorts of images have dangerous consequences in terms of how many more times are we going to teach our people that through the sacrificial body, conflict resolution happens either for the person at the individual level or the nation state.
We've talked a lot. I do want to just end with the question in terms of whether we like the movie or not. This movie is out. It's on track to be one of A24's biggest opening weekends of all time. How should we, at this table, but also listeners, approach talking about this movie with friends and relatives in a healthy, productive manner? Because I think this is a tough film where I do think it's going to start conversations one way or the other.
I will say, like, even on the press tour, because I've been following it for a while, the cast on various news outlets talking about what they hope people get from the film, and it is the idea, the sobering idea that, obviously, yes, the war is bad, but more than that, and I do think it does accomplish this too. It's what's more frightening than just obviously any kind of glorification of violence is a desensitization and numbness to violence. And we're already there. We're already there. Like, what's happening in Gaza is not affecting a lot of people. Like, they don't care. Like, it's on the, like, we hear, oh yeah, the number is up to 13,000, including children. It's just like, you know what I mean? Like, people's reactions to it is like, yeah, terrible things happen all over. Like, we're not engaging in that. And I think that if anything that this is the cautionary tale of, it is to not lose that common humanity that we do have, to continue to care, to not turn into Kirsten Dunst and have a scowl on your face and be so emotionally detached from what is in front of you, that if we remove that aspect of it, that where we are numb to what we're witnessing, then anything is possible. Because at that point, the consequence of death, you know what I mean? Like, we don't care if that doesn't affect you, doesn't make you mad as hell. You know what I mean? Like, to see that kind of thing happen to another human being anywhere, unjustly, then that's, I think that's the worst thing that could happen to the country, is that we just no longer care about human life.
James, what would you say in terms of like just suggestions for how to talk about this film with others?
Don't.
But it's going to happen.
No, a grad school professor taught me once, in terms of writing essays, that we get to frame the discussions that we're in. And so, like, for instance, when I was doing my master's thesis, I was going to argue that what people were calling torture porn films were actually just warmed over slasher films. So I was going to begin the thesis, by saying, like, critics have been calling these movies torture porn. Here are some examples of them saying that. I'm now going to prove that they're wrong. And Brian was like, something separately. He had said to me, he's like, James, no, you frame the debate always and forever. Never let somebody else frame the conversation for you. You frame it. Because if you're having to defend, you're losing. I think if someone brings up this film, I think it's worth asking them maybe some questions like, well, what was it about the film that you found engaging, intriguing, worth talking about? And whatever that idea is, that's where I think it's about pushing them away from this film and pushing them toward, like, well, what was it about this film that spoke to you as someone encountering art? And now go there, like, go to that conversation, right? I think how do you shift the conversation over to questions of the statistics we were talking about earlier, where 1 in 5 Americans right now, right, believe that violence is the way to solve political discourse. You start going there. You start talking about the actual civil war. That needs to be the conversation. I just don't think there's anything in this film worth discussing except to make it an opening salvo into the real civil war, the real roots of those causes, the unresolved issues of that, including the fact that the second the Civil War ended, this is on the Wikipedia page for public education, the second it ended, Southern conservatives, who were Democrats at the time, did everything they could to not fund public education. So now you can shift to the conversation about what have we done about public education since. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I just don't think there is anything about this film that is worth anyone's time, and people will see it. And then the question has to be for them, well, what was it about the movie that spoke to you? And now use that as a way into, because I promise you, whatever it was, it actually is indicative of something much deeper in terms of the real divisions. But I think that begins with listening to people.
that was similar to what I would say, was ask a lot of questions and listen, and then try to figure out, through your listening, really hone in on what are the things they're actually wanting to talk about and figure out how to steer the conversation to those. And also back to, wouldn't it be bad if we let this be some sort of cause for us to reach a state where this is the only way we can make progress is through violence. All right, well, that is all we have time for today. Lengthy conversation, great conversation. Hey, James, thanks so much for taking time to sit down and record this with us on a Friday evening for listeners who are tuning in on Wednesday.
I saw it by myself, so I had no one to discuss. I read a review afterwards or two, so I really appreciate getting to hear you all's perspectives and hearing what worked and didn't work with you all. And I appreciate you hearing mine too, and just being able to join everybody.
Where can listeners follow you and all the work you're doing here in the city or online?
Sure. So James for OKC on Instagram and Facebook. I'm much more active on Instagram because images, and that's fun. Yeah. But you can follow me there. Or if you ever need anything officially from the city council side of things, Ward 2 at okc.gov.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us. LaRon Chapman, where can people follow you at?
And you can follow my film column on the cinematropolis.com, Real Insights with LaRon Chapman.
Check it out, ladies and gentlemen. And you can find me on all the social medias at C Masters Talk. That's letter C Masters Talk, Instagram, Letterboxd, X, whatever. Follow me there. And of course, you can find all the things we're doing over at the cinematropolis.com. Thank you so much for joining us, listeners. We'll catch you again next time when we move back away from the heated political discourse and into the super fun world of horror with the latest film from the Radio Silence directing duo. Those are the directors of Scream 5, 6, and Ready or Not. When we review the surprise vampire film that's not a surprise, Abigail. It's going to be a fun one. I can't wait.